This is Unit 13, Planning for a Sustainable and Resilient Future. This is your instructor, Dr. John Rennie. The unit objectives for this week is to describe the key points for governance for resilient cities and communities, to describe the 5 steps for creating resilient cities that are vital to produce change at the city level, and to describe 7 goals that cities need to continually strive for to create resilient and sustainable cities. In order not to get behind, you should have completed all of the units 1 through 12. This is the last substantive lecture of the semester. The readings for this week are chapters 21, 25, and 26 in the Creating Resilient Sustainable Cities book, and we will go through those here in a moment. Chapter 21 in Resilient Sustainable Cities, A Future, edited by Leonie Pearson, Peter Newton, and Peter Roberts, looks at governance for resilient, sustainable cities and communities. This chapter is a little bit dense, but it's really informative. They get into the whole idea of what is governance. They note that governance is the steering capacity or an active rather than passive role for governance at all spatial levels. And governance for resilient and sustainable places should be at the inclusive end of the governance spectrum. They refer to Arnstein's 1969 paper on citizen power, where she looks at ladders of citizen participation. And on the one side, citizens are not very much involved in making decisions that relate to the governance of their communities. And at the other side, there is strong citizen participation or citizen power. And they say that sustainable and resilient places should be at the inclusive end of that governance spectrum. They note that the Brundtland Report by the United Nations in 1987 encouraged effective citizen participation in decision making. And it's important because there's been a lot of pushback in the United States in recent years, particularly by very conservative groups and Tea Party groups that have basically noted that the Brundtland Commission and the United Nations are anti citizen empowerment, and that's actually not true. It's very opposite. And as you note, that the Brundtland Report encourages active and engaged citizen participation. There's the chapter talks about 3 elements of sustainable development that's needed. One is physical sustainable development to protect and manage resources to satisfy human need. The next is generational equity. The Brundtland Report in 87 defined sustainable development as meeting the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Meaning, we wouldn't muck up the place so that people can't live here in the future. And the second element of sustainable development noted in the chapter is this idea of generational equity. We need to ensure that future needs are satisfied, and also this idea of global equity. We need to prioritize the needs of the global poor over wealthier nations, because the global poor are bearing the brunt of the economic hardships, environmental hardships, and we really, as a globe, need to figure out how we can work to create more equity and raise the standard of living of people living in poor nations. Now, the authors note that governance, as distinct from government, can be applied to various spatial scales. Governance is about the management of collective matters in the public realm. And we have to note that there are multiple levels of governance that add to the complexity. People can have governance in the form of neighborhood associations that address issues within a small geographic area. There's governance at the citywide level. You elect city council members of a city or town council. There's counties in the United States and some other places. Then, of course, there's metropolitan regions, and then there's state and federal levels. So all of these levels are important to work together in order to create the opportunity for resilient, sustainable communities. Now, they give examples of Ontario, Canada, and Knowsley, United Kingdom. In Ontario, Canada, they look at this idea of a full and integrated range of health services within the fields of community development, social services, and health. In that case, they noted, demonstrates the importance of ensuring effective democratic control and forging collaborative agreements across policy areas. Now, in Knowsley, United Kingdom, they look at the district and neighborhood level. In this case, the First Arc Group, which is a community-based housing association, has tried to create more collaborative and citizen-based governance by allowing the tenants of the housing to be a part of the board, along with some nominated and independent members on those boards. Then they noted there's other local boards that interact in the governance with that main board of the First Arc Group, and they need to work together in order to they are working together in order to create a sustainable and resilient model within their community. Now, the authors go on to note that this case demonstrates the importance of involving local people from the outset in governance and of linking grassroots engagement with real powers of policy determination and decision making. So it's enabling citizens to be able to make their own decisions. Now, just enabling citizens to make decisions does not always result in resilient outcomes. And later in the chapter, they talk about the idea of 4 clusters of activities that are needed with regards to resilience in governments. 1 is subsistence, 2 is adaptation, 3 is engagement, and 4 is opportunity. Now, some of the key points from the entire chapter are summarized at the end, looking at governance for resilient cities and communities. They note that cities and communities should be robust to be able to cope with the demands of both the present and the future. They need to be accessible and inclusive in order to ensure the widest possible participation and engagement through both formal government structures and other organizations that perform the role of managers of collective affairs. Next, they look at the need for the ability to operate at all relevant spatial levels, and especially from the scale of the metropolitan region to the individual neighborhood or locality. So they're really defining resilient communities being from the local government all the way up to the regional government. They need to be able to demonstrate formal democratic legitimacy, which itself will reflect the specific characteristics of national and subnational democratic arrangements and encapsulate the wider functions expected of governance system as a means of fostering and supporting deliberative democracy. The idea of deliberative democracy has been worked on a lot by the Kettering Foundation. So if you want to learn more about that specific idea of deliberative democracy, which is allowing people to, with opposing viewpoints, to come together, and rather than conflicting, like, this is my point and that's your point, and they're directly in juxtaposition to other. The deliberative democracy is that there's always a third way. There's more than 2 ways to look at any topic. There's typically 3, 4, 5, many different ways or more. And deliberative democracy is working in a process through democracy to be able to hear multiple points of view and to be able to find a path forward that's supported upon by by a democratic process. Now, in our country, we tend to think of democracy as being all conservative versus liberal or Republicans versus Democrats. But in reality, the Kettering Foundation, and I urge you to go look at the Kettering Foundation's website. They have a lot of great resources there about this concept of deliberative democracy and how we can move forward. Going back to the chapter, the authors again conclude, another conclusion they have is to be capable of developing integrated approaches to the delivery of policy. This may both be through structures of partnership and collaboration and through other forms of cooperation and integration, such as joint delivery organizations. And finally, be subject to scrutiny, evaluation, and review, and be open to transparency across all aspects of policy and practice. So, continuing on, they note there are 6 conclusions and guidelines for future practice. One is that governance for resilient places needs to be capable of coping with complex and rapidly changing urban systems. Again, multiple agencies, multiple levels of governance. We have, governance that, is not even part of the traditional, town, city, county, state. I mean, we have school, in some places, school districts are separated out from local governments. We have water districts. We have transportation authorities. All of these are kind of multiple layers on top of one another that lead to the whole entire idea of governance. And what they're saying is that we need to be able to be capable of coping with this complex and rapidly changing set of systems that we deal with in a governance basis. Number 2 is the need for continuum of governance across resilient places. Problems that impact cities and communities do not necessarily problems that impact cities and communities do not respect administrative boundaries. Okay, so what does this mean? A hurricane comes. It's going to come up the coast. It's going to bombard the state of Florida. That problem of that disaster doesn't necessarily just get isolated to one town, one county, one community, or even one state, because often, these hurricanes hit multiple states. So, and of course, we have other problems like air pollution and sea level rise. Again, these problems don't impact just one particular jurisdiction. Number 3 is effective governance emanates from all sectors and types, including both top-down and bottom-up structures. And they should include all types of organizations, including public, nonprofit, and private organizations. All need to be a part of the process to have effective governance for sustainable and resilient places. 4th is a guideline that a governance system for resilient, sustainable places needs to encompass all relevant elements of both policymaking and implementation. The 5th point is also a guideline, is that there's a need to mesh together the traditional elected democratic structures of governance of places and the wider instruments of agencies of governance. So what that means is that not all governance is just based on people who are elected. There are a lot of what they call wider instruments of agencies of governance. That could be transit agencies, it could be water districts. And while some of them may have elected boards, they're not always, comprised of the traditional elected sorts of politicians that we think of when it comes to the whole election process. And there is a lot of elected officials of boards, particularly in Florida. People are elected to the Port Authority. People are elected to the water district. People elected to the school board. But that doesn't happen in every place, and not all. For example, Tri-Rail. I don't believe Tri-Rail has an elected board. I think it's an appointed board. So that speaks to those issues. Number 6 is the need for education, training, and support of all those involved in the governance of cities and communities. That's pretty self-explanatory. And they note that the very essence of resilience is that it's about responding to both known and unknown events And this implies the need continually to update and upgrade both intelligence and skills in order to provide willingness to act. So moving on to chapter 26. Sorry, this should say chapter. Oh no, this is chapter 25. I think I might got the last one wrong, but this is written by Gil Penalosa and Leone Pearson. And Gil Penalosa is a pretty famous character. He talks a lot about the tremendous growth of populations occurring around the world. Over the past 40 years, we've gone from 3 billion to 7 billion, and the rate of population growth is slowing, but we're still continuing to grow substantially. So by the year 2050, there'll probably be another 3 billion people on the planet. Today, 50% of the global population live in cities. By 2050, it's expected that 80% are going to live in cities. And he talks about this perfect storm of being overwhelming with regards to thinking about sustainable and resilient communities, which is population growth, traffic, global warming, obesity crisis, other public health issues, economic crises, but that most decision makers are reluctant to be pioneers. Everyone wants to live in a place that may have, great walking and cycling and parks and trails and better public health and better transportation systems and better opportunities for recreation and economic development and a greener environment. These are all wonderful ideals, but yet most people and particularly most decision makers or politicians are not necessarily willing to be pioneers to actually do what it takes to make that happen. So he goes on and he talks about how this chapter focuses on implementation, and he identifies barriers to change in cities. One barrier to change is that we're not a Copenhagen, we're not a Portland, Oregon, we're not a Boulder, Colorado, we're not a Melbourne, Australia. And he said that, even those places when they first started had the same barriers and they overcame those barriers. Another barrier, he notes, is kind of this idea of the climate with regards to mobility. It's too cold to walk or bike, it's too hot to walk or bike. And he notes that he quotes someone who says that there's really nothing that's too hot or too cold. It's all about the clothing that you wear. And we're gonna see a little video here in a moment. Talk a little bit more about that. He talks that it's not part of our culture. This is a common barrier that people note that, we can't do this because it's just not ingrained in our culture. And again, he notes that all these places have encountered that. And, he talks about making change in cities. He was the former commissioner of parks, sport, and recreation in Bogota, Colombia, and then he moved to Canada where he runs a nonprofit called 880 Cities. He created 200 parks in Bogota and a large Simon Bolivar Park, summer festival with 100 events that 3 million people attended. And he boils down his lessons to 5 elements to generate change in cities. One is a shared sense of urgency. 2 is a political will or the guts to do it. 3 is leadership. 4 is doers in the public sector. And 5 is citizen participation. And he notes our priorities must be vulnerable citizens, the children, the older adults, and the poor. So let's hear him speak for a little bit about his insights.
Creating 8 to 80 cities and moving from talking to do it. And actually someone said, oh, it might rain today. That's why, here in Melbourne, we don't walk or we don't bike. And that reminded me that when we talk about the weather, and I was working about this time last year. I was in Cuba working for the Canadian government. And people in Cuba said, oh, we don't walk or bike because it's too hot. And then I took the plane back to Canada where we are based. And when I got to Canada, they said, oh, here it's too cold. So we always have an excuse. So actually it's nice to hear our Danish friends when they say there is no such thing as bad weather. It's bad clothing. So each part of it is about change. And how are we going to change? And when we see change ahead, it's always nice to talk to the children. And almost everywhere I go around the world, I try to talk to the children. Here we ask them, why don't you draw? How would you like your community to be like when you are your parents' age and you have children of your own age? And look at Edgar, for example. Edgar said that he wanted fewer people in cars and more people walking and more people cycling. And then he drew an area for pedestrians, for cyclists, for buses, or for cars. He's only 13, but he knows that if we mix pedestrians and cyclists, the pedestrian gets injured. If we mix cyclists and buses and cars, the cyclist gets injured. So each one needs a separate space. And then he drew public parks and low buildings with street level activity. In last November, I was in Korea at the National University working with the PhD students, very smart. And I said, hey guys, you better study very, very hard because now the 13-year-olds can summarize urban planning in one drawing. And if we had a community like this, we would have pretty good communities. So they say it's not rocket science. No, maybe it's not rocket science. Maybe rocket science is how to get it done. And people ask me, why 8 to 80? What do you mean by 8 to 80? And they say, is this intersection safe? Can I send my kids riding to school or my grandmother to go to the park or the market? I said, look, let's use a rule of thumb. What if everything that we did in our public places had to be fantastic for the 8 and the 80-year-olds? Then we would end up with pretty good communities for all. So that's the idea of the 8 to 80. We need to stop building cities as if everybody was 30-year-old and athletic. Let's build cities for everyone. That's how we're going to move from talking to doing and creating 880 cities. And yeah, we're thinking and we're talking about walking and cycling and parks and sustainable communities. We're thinking and talking, but not enough doing. So today we're going to be talking a little bit on how can we move from talking to doing. Last year I was invited as a keynote speaker at FA20 in Copenhagen, and every time that I go to Copenhagen it's fantastic because it's like a reality check. Almost every community says we're moving, and yes, we're moving, but many are moving at the speed of the turtles. And then they find another turtle and they say, oh, I might be slow, but I'm ahead of you. So they are benchmarking with communities that are worse. If we always benchmark ourselves with communities that are worse, eventually we're going to end up looking like those. But if we end up benchmarking with communities that are the best around, eventually we're also going to be looking like those. So, let's get back to Copenhagen. And by the way, when I'm talking about Copenhagen, I don't want anybody at the end saying, oh, Gil, here in Melbourne, we are different. We got nothing in common with Copenhagen or New York or Bogota. We are unique. Yeah, that reminds me of the quote, always remember that you are absolutely unique, just like everyone else. Yeah. Even within Melbourne, each community, each neighborhood is different. But this is not like on the computers that we copy and paste. It is how to adapt and improve. It's not about copying, it's adapting and improving. And change is hard. And let's take a look at some of the change. I'm a senior consultant with the Danish firm Gale Architects that is fantastic. And my friends at Gale tell me, in Copenhagen, when they were going to create the first pedestrian street, people say, oh, pedestrian street? No, we don't want any pedestrian street. What do you mean pedestrian street? They said, we got too many cars. And the weather is terrible. It's cold in the winter, it's hot in the summer, and then it rains all year. But the number one barrier was pedestrian. That's not part of our culture. Pedestrian, that's for the Italians. Because the Italians are loud and noisy and they like to be on the streets. But we are Danish and we are quiet and we are cold and we don't go out. Well, let me tell you, the Danish are more Italian than the Italians. They love their pedestrian streets. In the summer, in the winter, in the rain. This is City Hall in Copenhagen. They went from car invasion to people places. More than 18 of these have been turned into people places. This was the first pedestrian street and still vibrant. And it's how to have safe transportation for pedestrians and for cyclists and for transit and for everybody. And in the last 40 years, look how cycling has been increasing. And 4 out of 10 people use the bike as the mode of transportation. That's how they go to the theater. That's how even women are texting their boyfriends when they're cycling. And it's not just about men 20 to 40 in Lycra. No. It's everybody. It's the women in high heels and skirts, and it's for everybody. This is what we need in every city around the world, children and women and older adults. And when cycling has doubled since 1990, they got traffic jams. What a nice problem to have. Can you imagine? 70% of the people that bike in the summer, they bike when there's snow. But then they plow the roads and so on. So it's nice, So change is hard. But also change offers wonderful opportunities. So that's what we're going to be talking about. And now I want to go over some elements on how can we move from talking to doing and creating 880 cities. So I'm going to go through this very fast. 5 elements. One, sense of urgency. Some people say, oh, Copenhagen has taken 40 years, so we also got 40 years. No, unfortunately, we do not have 40 years. We cannot, On the one thing, we're facing a perfect storm. We got traffic congestion, and we got climate change, and we got obesity crisis, and economic crisis, and all of them seem to be going at the same time. And on top of that, we got population growth. Melbourne or Toronto, where we are based, these cities are going to grow by more than 50% in the next 25 years. And in the world population is going to grow by 3 billion. So not only do we have to improve the cities that we have today, but we got to create great cities for 3 billion additional people. So what kind of cities are we going to build? How do we want to live? The reality is that if we define our cities around cars, we just get more cars. And then we got to go out and invite our friends to help us cross the street. This isn't far from reality. The roads are getting wider, the cars are going faster, we're living longer, so we're getting older. But when we define the cities around people, then we get healthier people and happier people, and we get better quality of life. And in an ever more globalized world where the best people can live anywhere they want to, quality of life is the most important tool of economic competitiveness. Second one is political will. God, when talking about political will, what is the role of our streets? Are we building streets for cars or streets for people? Do we want our streets to look like car storage or streets that actually create community? This 4-story car parking that actually work like a vacuum, a gigantic vacuum that sucks the life out of the cities, or street level activity. So these are the things, parking, 93 cars used to park here, now 50,000 people come. So who buys more, 93 cars or 50,000 people? So these are the kind of things. What is the role of the streets? The street space is the most valuable asset in any city. So how are we going to distribute it? Clearly, pedestrians and transit should be first. Let me tell you a little bit about New York, because New York is doing some of the most transformative things. This woman, Janet Sarikan, the Commissioner of Transportation, and the Commissioner of Planning, Amanda Burden, they are transforming the city. For example, 9th Avenue. They went to 9th Avenue. They saw cars on both sides, very dangerous for the cyclists. They went on the New York Times. They said, we're going to create an area for pedestrians, an area for cyclists, an area for cars. And not 30 months later, not 30 weeks later, but 30 days later, they had transformed 9th Avenue. And going from this to this is not about money. It's about having the vision and the guts. Broadway is an avenue that crosses New York. I took this photo 2 years ago. Who were using the bike lanes, the cars, and the kamakazes? So I went back last year, and what was Janet doing? Look at this. She was taking away 2 lanes from the cars in order to give it to the cyclists and to the pedestrians with umbrellas and chairs and all of this. And now look at this, Times Square, right in the heart. She's taking away not 2 lanes, the whole thing, 8 blocks, all of it pedestrian. So this is about having the vision. This is about having the leadership. So that's why I say we need a Janet Sarikan in every city, a leader who looks for solutions to the problems and not problems to the solutions. Number 3, leadership. When we talk about leadership, we always think about these world leaders. But no, I want to tell you about this other one, Anne Fenton. She's a friend. She's a teacher of physical education in Orangeville, Ontario. And look at this. She saw that each year fewer and fewer kids were walking to school. And she said, why? They were afraid of the cars. So when they went on holidays, they came back and she was dressed up as a pylon. She shut down the parking lot of the school. And she created 5 drop-off zones no less than 500 meters from the school. And then all of a sudden, the kids started walking to school. The kids started biking. So, we need thousands of Anne Fentons. Number 4, we need doers. And in doers, I want to talk a bit about Bogota, not really because I was commissioner of Parks and Recreation or because afterwards one of my brothers became mayor. Maybe I did a good job as a commissioner, that's why he became mayor. But because Bogota has 1/8 the per capita income of Australia or the US or Canada. And I'm not saying that it's on the same league as this wonderful city. I'm not that crazy. But nevertheless, between 95 and 2001, we did interesting things. We built 5 metropolitan parks, 50 zone parks, and over 800 neighborhood parks. This was one of the metropolitan parks. The Pope came, gave a mass for 1 million people, then they just put a wire fence. And in 36 months, we turned it into this. And we created sidewalks and bikeways and places for people to walk, and gigantic playgrounds and wave pools and all kinds of things, because this is about creating community and physical activity and so on, and also how to be sustainable and how to do these activities. If you're going to do a velodrome, let's put 3 different sports facilities in the same area. Here we were going to do surface parking, and then someone was going to do a library. We said, what do you do the library? With underground parking, and the community got the library and the parking, and all of a sudden we got a wonderful library with great parking, and it's great for the community. So these are some of the things. From Bogota, another thing is Ciclovia. Ciclovia is on Sundays, we open the streets to the people and we close them to the cars. And then this is great for a time of economic recession because you don't have to build any infrastructure. You get the roads. All you really got to do is close it. And then this has worked very, very well. And along those roads, we do aerobics and we do wall climbings and other kinds of things. This is from the American Airlines magazine. You know, everybody, young and old and rich and poor. Now we get 1.3 million people every Sunday of the year. And you know, and the last thing I want to mention is separated bikeways. We built 280 kilometers of separated bikeways and went from 28,000 to over 350,000 people riding their bikes. And this is really interesting in all kinds of neighborhoods. There were some places that you would never even dream in Melbourne. I mean, not even dream in your nightmares. It was so poor that there were no sidewalk, there were no pavement. But look at the quality of the pedestrian area, the quality of the cycling. And you got to be consistent. If we say pedestrians first, and then cyclists, and then cars. You know, we didn't have money for all of it. So it was either pedestrians and cyclists or cars. And thank God the city chose the first two. And now we got people like this beautiful girl are very happy to do it. And the last point is public participation. In public participation, you know, with the Ministry of Health Promotion in Canada, we're working all over Ontario. And we go, the people are eager to participate. You know, the people are so generous. We went to a place like Sudbury, for example, minus 35 degrees. We do a public meeting and we get over 100 people at the public meeting. You know, they could be home watching TV or reading a book or having a coffee next to the fireplace. No, they go to a public meeting because they want to make their community better. And then we ask them, tell us about your impatiens and tell us about your orchids. What are the impatiens? Things that are low cost, low risk, and high visibility. And then a woman says, Gil, you know, when I'm walking home, the sidewalk is very dark. I said, that's nice, but that's not low cost. She said, no, it's very low cost because the street is very well lit. And the sidewalks are very dark. All I'm asking is for someone to go up on a ladder and turn the light the other way. When you ask the community, people come with wonderful ideas. And she's totally right. The streets don't need lights because the cars already have lights. We need the lights on the sidewalk. So those are the kind of things. So I totally agree that we got to ask the community. Orchids are higher cost, 2 to 5 years. Then we went to city council and we went to university. And we also asked the children. For example, the children, we asked them, you know, what your community would be like if it was more walkable or bikeable? And this kid that is going to be mayor someday said, more people will want to stay and more people will want to come. He made the link of a walkable community and economic development. So, in conclusion, we need to think outside the box. This is a time to build alliances. This is a time to build alliances between the public and the private sector and the not-for-profit, between the municipality and the state and the federal and all departments, the education and the environment and transportation and public health and so on. And we got some challenges, but more than challenges, we got wonderful opportunities. How do we create A280 cities? It's not about the money. We saw what they did in New York. It's not a technical issue. It's a political one. That's why we need the 5 elements: a sense of urgency. We need the political will. The politicians have to understand that the general interest must prevail over particular. We need leadership, hundreds of inventos. We need doers, you know, people that realize that the citizens are paying them to get things done, not to have too many reasons why things cannot be done. We need public participation. Everybody has to realize public cannot be a spectator any longer. If you're not sending the emails, if you're not making the phone calls, if you're not writing to the editor, someone else is, and that someone else is setting the agenda. So the ducks are in a row. You know, we've been focusing too much on doing things right. But now, in addition to doing things right, we got to focus on doing the right things as we create 880 cities and as we move from talking to doing. I wish you all the best in each one of your communities. Thank you very much.
So the final chapter looks at how we bring all of this together in terms of different goals. They present these 7 different goals, which is to be dynamic, start with people in place, collaboration and social cohesion, maximize equity, employment, and justice, and design to address externalities, and value and enhance green space and technological innovation. And then for each of these goals, they provide opportunities to achieve those goals and blockers. So under the Be Dynamic, there's kind of a collective vision for low carbon, equitable food and shelter. And some of the blockers could be public policy caution associated with electoral cycles at all levels of government, media, celebration of special interests, pleas, This kind of one table brings together each of those goals. It's important with starting with community participation, as Gil Penalosa was talking about, having community participation in planning. Some of the blockers of that is there's often not a shared narrative. There's a compartmentalization of views by stakeholders. With regards to collaboration and social cohesion, it's important to work with grassroots organizations and explicit policy objectives and support. Under maximize equity, employment, and justice, looking at housing tenure, that's whether you rent or own, and change in governance and institutions, leadership that is engaged with the community. Um, you know, some of the blockers of that is a lack of connection between community activism and strategic government action. And looking at design to address externalities, there's the opportunity to integrate co-production design for multiple purposes. So, for example, recreation with carbon sequestration, flood mitigation, design for low carbon precincts that reduce material consumption. Of course, there's difficult challenges with regards to achieving these things, such as the disconnect between short and long term evaluations and costs. And then under value and enhance green space, the idea about green design is a tremendous opportunity to create a sustainable and resilient community. We need to have better integration of public and private green assets, remove barriers to access green space, greening urban buildings and space, using underutilized land, um, rethinking zoning and planning requirements. Of course, there's a number of blockers that are challenging for all of these. And then under technological innovation, there is certainly the opportunity for private and public interest through collaborative research. The far right column talks about the chapters that address each one of these goals. So that concludes this unit.